So Joe's going to talk to us about something very interesting, and please, Mr. Joe Manjaly.
Thank you, Jeremy, for asking me to give this talk. Jeremy's been a great mentor to me, and I'm grateful for him to invite me up here. And so I'm going to cover how I think life as a surgeon has changed over a generation as a way of understanding how it might continue to change in the next. And I'm going to offer some opinion on how I think we might need to respond to that as a profession. It was this letter published in The Guardian 18 months ago that really got me thinking about this subject. I'll read it to you. It was written by a consultant neurologist in Liverpool. So, the Chancellor has announced that senior doctors' pay will rise about 3% due to their vital contribution. I'm a consultant neurologist. My salary already borders £95,000 a year. My duty, my goal in life, is to look after the sick, and I would do it for less. I don't need a pay rise. I need hospital beds. I need enough staff in the wards. I need appropriate social care so patients can return home safely. I need my patients to be able to afford a bus fare to come to clinics. Don't give us this money. Give it to the underpaid carers, cleaners, community services and councils. This would be a true vital contribution to the UK. Now, I know from the way that letter has been shared on social media that it will divide opinion. Some of you may look at it and think, well, that is someone who is truly vocation-focused and service-hearted. And then there will be others that look at it and think it's slightly self-flagellating. But the way the press can portray doctors nowadays does lead to some quite extreme stereotypes existing. But what's clear is that as a profession, we are perhaps more dissatisfied than we ever have been. And last year's GMC report showed that nearly a third of doctors felt unable to cope with the workload, nearly a fifth felt they were at high risk of burnout, and nearly a quarter were planning to leave the profession. And we get a copy of the Royal College Annals through our door every month. And one noticeable change is that the subject of burnout and work-life balance comes up so much more than it ever did, even 10 years ago. And that's a big change from even when I was applying for a number back in 2012, where certainly it felt that getting into ENT was an absolute golden ticket. Entry was fiercely popular at the time. There was no question that you would do whatever it took and go wherever it took to get into training. And being geographically picky was certainly unheard of. And this paper I wrote at the time showed that 50% of the people that got a number moved location in order to take up training. But the atmosphere has changed somewhat, and taking time out after F2 is commonplace and it's rising, and many doctors are not exactly excited about coming back into training, many thinking about alternative career options, and being geographically picky is very much normal now. And burnout is the fastest reason for taking a break cited. Now, when we take a closer look at the reasons surgical trainees give for leaving the profession, things like work-life balance, inflexible working arrangements, a lack of consistency in working environment, problems with learning culture and workplace expectations. That was from a paper written by a group of ENT surgeons in the Bulletin only 18 months ago. But these are all things that they would never be uttered in the surgical wing of a hospital a generation ago, certainly by anyone that would be perceived to be serious about a career in surgery. So what's changed? Is it just that doctors now need to be more resilient? You will hear that said, that doctors nowadays are not resilient enough, that they focus too much on hours and exception reporting, that money matters too much. And after all, shouldn't medical students know what they were signing up for? And the elephant in the room is also, wasn't it much worse a generation ago? And so that is perhaps one question I'm going to try and answer in this talk. How are things different to now? Why are we in this position? And why do we have this vibe? And then I will then go on to offer some of my own personal opinion on how I think we might need to respond and mitigate those changes. There are a few reasons why I'm probably well placed to give this talk. Number one is that I need to feel confident that I'm not going to be judged too harshly. I need to be able to speak frankly without fear that it's going to affect my career prospects, so it probably helps that I'm not a trainee. Secondly, you need to know that I will be objective, and so it's probably helpful to say that this talk really isn't about me. I've certainly had some various unfair advantages. I've had public school education, help onto the London property ladder. I've got colleagues currently that have been a huge support to me, both in the NHS and in my private practice endeavours. So I've never burnt out, and this is not about me, this is about how I perceive the generation coming up behind me. And I am the child of an ENT consultant. So my father was is a consultant on the South Coast. And what more, I was born when he was a very young SHO. So I really remember his training journey, including some of the struggles that involved. And so I'm probably well placed to compare that experience to my current lived one and of that of my trainees. So let's start with the question, wasn't junior doctor life much harder a generation ago? And I've had the opportunity of interviewing a large number of doctors from all sorts of generations when preparing this talk. And the answer probably is that it was harder a generation ago. These are the sorts of things that came up in those discussions: working 120 hours a week, being resident 1 in 2 on calls. I'm sure some of the older members of the audience will relate to some of these things. And certainly when your compatriot was on leave, you were 1 in 1 on call. And that meant being you, Thursday morning till Monday evening non-stop, heavy volume outpatients. The firm was generally run by the senior registrar, so consultants weren't always available. There was certainly less focus on time spent outside of your profession, and relocating was very much the norm of the day. You would have to apply for a new job every 6 months, and that might mean relocating to different parts of the country every 6 months, with the obvious impact that would have had on family life. Attitudes to diversity were commensurate with the national culture of that time, and selection processes were perhaps less formalised and transparent than they are now. And you could remain at the same grade for many years. You could remain a registrar for more than a decade without any guarantee that you would move further than that. Now, of course, there were things to mitigate all that. Certainly doing your best was very much the order of the day over getting it right first time. Doctors probably felt more license over protocol back then. And certainly there was a firm loyalty, spirit, camaraderie, and certainly an accountability to each other that may be different compared to today. The mess and the canteen, probably don't need to say much more about that. And the longer hours probably meant that continuity of care was more fluid, and perhaps patient expectations were lower. But the approach to medicine at that time was characterised by long working hours and an assumption that the answer to every problem was that it could be solved by simply working harder, no matter what the sacrifice. And that's probably encompassed in this paper, which was written by an Irish qualitative study labelling the so-called boomer generation approach to medicine, that medicine is your life, don't take on too many responsibilities that get in the way with that, show toughness by working long hours, and cope well with heavy workloads because it's better for your training. Don't hand over patients to anyone, and time spent abroad may benefit your career. Now, there were 2 huge changes that probably changed the direction of surgical training as we know it. And again, many of you will be familiar with these, but some of the younger members of the audience may not be. Prior to Calmanisation, there was a lack of guaranteed progression through training. As I said, you would move geographical location fairly frequently, and it was very hard to pass the Part 1 of the FRCS. Many trainees took it up to 6 or 7 times. Calmanisation came in 1997. It made for a more structured, progressive training model that meant that your overall training was likely to be shorter. And that probably changed the working life of consultants significantly, who up until that point would have been able to rely on their senior registrar for pretty much anything. The European Working Time Directive came in a year later. Before that, it was estimated that a surgeon would clock up more than 30,000 hours of training before they became a consultant. And when that came into law, it was suggested that that number fell to around 6,000 hours. Now, it led to an end of life-consuming roster patterns. But interestingly, it at the time was met with opposition, not just from trainers, but from the trainees themselves, who felt that working too few hours would have an impact on how well they would be able to train. It could be argued that continuity of care suffered as we moved from an on-call pattern to a shift work pattern, and also it could be argued that training within those hours was sacrificed for service. If we think about some of the other things that make life different as a surgeon today, well, certainly the way we are seen by society has changed a lot. It's fair to say that there's probably a lot more scrutiny on us nowadays. The two gentlemen at the top may have had some role in that journey, and certainly the level of risk and vulnerability that we feel in the system we work in has also probably been affected by certain high-profile cases such as David Selou and Hadiza Bawagaba. And I think that that increased level of scrutiny has probably had an impact on training and how much we feel we can let our trainees do unsupervised. Bureaucracy and the erosion of admin support. So appraisal and revalidation are an industry, more so than they ever were. We all have to keep portfolios for revalidation. You want to improve your service, it will probably involve several forms to fill and several committees and layers of middle management to get through. And the change in technology probably means that a lot of that admin is now done directly by us rather than being outsourced to administrative help. And the population has grown, and with that, so have we. There are so many more consultants now than there were a generation ago, and we are more specialised, and we more as the ability in what we can offer has changed, so have the expectations, and so subspecialising has become a way of responding to that. It used to be the case that a consultant pretty much had the final word on how a department was run, your theatre list, your clinic template. Nowadays, not much happens without the blessing of middle management. And the concept of the medical hierarchy has no doubt evolved over that time as well, and the deity-like figure of old has largely faded away. And patients too have Google, and they're much more well-researched, and so the doctor-patient relationship has changed, and patients may feel more like consumers now in what they come to your clinic asking you to do. And as a result, us surgeons have probably had to find ways of maintaining our self-esteem in different ways. And with technology has certainly led to the blurring of work and home. So I can respond to emails and make decisions for my team on the fly, on the walk to the tube home. I can look at scans and whatnot at home on my home computer. And instant messaging means that no one really needs to wait to get a clinical decision from me. And what more, I have a PA in the NHS who's excellent, but I know that she also covers 5 other consultants. And so there's a limit to what I can fairly ask her to do. And so, naturally, administration is more in our hands, and we are therefore much more accessible without filter than ever before. So that's a lot about how things have changed, but what does that mean for where we are going in the future? Well, I'm going to present what I see to be a pattern of change which may affect how our career will look in the future, and then I will share some opinion on how I think we need to mitigate that. And I will start by being very un-British and covering the very uncomfortable topic of economics. And I hope you'll forgive me for doing that, but it should become clear why I have started with that. Now, no one goes into medicine to become rich, I'd like to think. And consultant salaries are higher now than they were in the early 90s. But when you look at the numbers more closely, the results really are quite intriguing. When you take into account inflation, the real terms value of the consultant salary in the UK has fallen nearly a third in the last decade. And that is quite a change, and it means that every year that we decline an inflation matching pay rise, the salary that your successor will inherit is falling and falling. That's not necessarily true of all careers, so a would-be medic, 18-year-old leaving school now, does have the option of law, tech and finance, and I have validated this with my brother who got exactly the same grades at school as me whose firm do pay 24-year-olds £150,000 a year. Not that I'm bitter at all, because after all, we do work in the best job. But these are junior doctor salaries that exist now. So starting off at just over £28,000 a year, and by the 10th year of working, this will have risen to £56,000 a year. Plus, you get a little bit more for being on call, a little bit more for weekends if you work them frequently. And then there's London waiting, which interestingly has not changed in a long time. So now the press will always highlight how these salaries are well above other jobs in society, and that is true. What those comparisons don't account for, of course, is the financial and social trade-off of becoming a senior doctor or surgeon. And the brightest school leavers will look at these things. And while salaries haven't risen with inflation, the cost of training and subscribing probably has. So this paper published in the BMJ suggests that a trainee wanting to become a surgeon will probably have to spend just under £20,000 on average of their own money getting themselves trained. I do think that we rely more than ever on courses because of that increased scrutiny on our surgical outcomes. And subscriptions to various professional bodies have gone up as well, including the GMC and indemnity fees. So it's been a slow creep, but there have been a number of major changes that will affect the current generation of young doctors. The biggest one being the fact that it costs £9,000 a year in tuition fees to go to university nowadays, in addition to living expenses. And what more, the interest rates on that loan are now 9% over £27,000. Doctors used to be able to save a chunk of money in their F1 year by living freely. That's not there anymore. There have been changes to pension terms, 2008, 2015, and new consultants and senior consultants are very much affected by the tax laws on pensions, and many of you will be familiar with that. The normal retirement age has changed, so it's now pinned to state pension age, which is now 68. So retiring and returning at age 68 might feel like a very different prospect than it did a generation ago. And of course, you'll all be familiar with the junior doctor fallout of 6 years ago that arguably left a generation of juniors feeling very much like this is a job and not a vocation anymore. So all of this has resulted in some quite exponential changes to the economic life of doctors, even in just the last 10 years during which I've been a doctor. And if we think of some solutions, one might say, well, why not take a year out and just do a load of locums? Well, that's not necessarily that easy. The way the tax rules work mean that once you start earning over a certain amount, the marginal rate of tax gets to nearly 80%. And so you would have to work many, many hours to eat into your student loan in a meaningful way. And we know that house prices have grown over that time. So the median house price rose 259% between 1997 and 2016. Now, interest rates were very high in the early 1980s, but despite that, it would take on average 3 years to save for a deposit compared to 19 years now for a millennial. And so this might explain how a registrar in the early 90s could potentially buy a house and fund private school education on one salary, whereas many new London consultants now still rent. And then there's the subject of private practice. Well, of course, that is true. I count myself lucky to be able to work in this district. But it's worth pointing out that remuneration from insurance companies for various different ENT operations has not changed in the last 20 years, whereas your O2 and Virgin Media bill will rise with inflation, as I was reminded of recently. And arguably this phenomenon will only harm the NHS if consultants feel that they need to work more hours outside of the NHS. But of course, we are doing the best job in the world, aren't we? And when we're doing the best job in the world, economics should not matter. And after all, we need to be totally dedicated to the cause, and the patients come first. And all that is true. But the economic changes I've illustrated mean that doctors of tomorrow, rather than breaking net zero in their late 20s, will still be trying to break net zero in their 30s and 40s. And this becomes an issue because if you want to start a family, then naturally those thoughts will have to come during your 30s and 40s because fertility is the way it is. And so that is where I think there is becoming a crunch point in our profession. Now, excuse the caricature, but just to illustrate a point, a generation ago, a surgeon could support a young family on one salary, and so their spouse would have a choice. They could either pause work and take on the nights and the nursery pickups and whatnot, or they could pay for help and go to work. And therefore, it was probably not the norm to ever be seen struggling with issues like crying babies at night, breastfeeding, having to clock off from your operating list early to go and do the nursery pickup. And so arguably the surgeon parent under stress has become somewhat of an invisible phenomenon in our profession. But one of the major societal changes in a generation has been the evolution of personal relationships. Many more women go to medical school and have a successful career, and consequently, many more men are now likely to share parenting and other domestic responsibilities. But the critical change is this: the option for one of those people to stay at home is now much harder economically, but so too is the option to pay for comprehensive childcare on a medical wage. And therefore, the person who is doing the late nights and the pickups may well be the surgeon themselves. And just to illustrate this point, let's take an ST7 trainee who is typically going to be 33, 34 years old. They'll be working 1 in 6 weekends and accounting for current salary rates plus the loan repayment, which they still will be making at that point, they're likely to take home just over £3,000 a month. Now, I've put them in this flat, which looks as close to hospital accommodation as I could find on Rightmove, in a Zone 3 location that meant they could commute to most of the hospitals in our rotation. And that rent costs £1,500 a month for 2 bedrooms. And then so when you think about their basic utilities, the cost of getting to work and eating, that is going to exceed the leftover. And so 2 parents with a child, the spouse has to go to work, and therefore, if both people are at work, childcare has to be arranged. And when we look at the cost of childcare, an Ofsted-rated good nursery costs £1,500 with a tax rebate. And then when you cover the hours needed to be able to go to an operating list as a registrar, you would also need to employ some wraparound care that would cost about £1,300. And then once they go to school, there's also a shortfall between the number of annual leave days you have and the school holidays, so there's that to contend with as well. ST7's exam year, you throw in a basket of mandatory and slightly non-mandatory subscriptions, and you find that even 2 surgeons married to each other in the next generation are unlikely to be able to save anything without having some help. And this situation hits crunch point when a child is sick, which they often are, because, as many of you will know, the nursery will phone and they will say, your child has a temperature, please come and pick them up immediately. And so you drop your retractor and you have a decision to make. And what does the scrubbed surgeon do in that scenario? So let's look at some solutions. Well, you could have a live-in nanny. That is made slightly harder by the current rules around EU status. And of course, you need space in your house to be able to house an extra person. You could have a live-out nanny. That costs just under £4,000 if you live in southwest London, slightly less if you live in the northwest of England. Or you could have favours from friends and grandparents who themselves will be retiring older, remember, or compassion from your workplace. Now, in practical terms, that means the licence to cancel your clinic or your operating list at short notice. Not easy to do. And so you can see why working hours and a location near your social support network suddenly become less easily sacrificable to the next generation. And of course, parents who are struggling also puts pressure on people that are not parents, who might feel that they need to cover the gaps. Now, you might be listening to what I'm saying and thinking, well, my trainees don't have any of these issues. But if you think about it, there are a number of things family wealth, high-earning spouse, grandparents available that might mask some of these issues. And when you look around for trainees that don't have one of these three things, there are remarkably few, I would say. And that is something that we really need to be thinking about when we are trying to address the disparity in various different social and economic groups within our profession. And when you look at who is going to medical school in the next generation, we are having growing proportions of, well, certainly at least equal proportions of men and women, more people from disadvantaged backgrounds going into medicine. And so in the next generation, at a time when we're trying to tackle social mobility and gender inequality, these are all things we're going to have to be thinking about. Financial pressures lead to stress on surgeon parents, which leads to a distraction outside training. Now, surgeons are bright people, and when things get tight, then they're unlikely to necessarily give up. But a generation ago, I would say it would be pretty unusual, if not frowned upon, to have trainees that were running a business on the side of their training or doing injectables and fillers in their spare time. But it's becoming much more the norm now, and you can understand why. Increasingly, the sort of trainee that you'd want to have in your profession is seeing a career in surgery as something to balance alongside other responsibilities. Now, some of you might know this doctor who has a very prominent YouTube channel called Ali Abdaal. Now, in this video, which has been viewed over 1 million times, he describes why and how he doesn't feel full-time medicine is for him. Now, that's despite him being just the kind of person you'd want on your team. Very bright, Cambridge trained, very able. So that's a remarkable thing. And so when I see that, I worry, because I know that the only way we could all become excellent surgeons is by devoting yourself to your profession. And so the big question here is, if in the future surgeons are going to have too many responsibilities to do all the things that we have so far done for free, editing the journals, sitting on committees, writing your textbooks, which incidentally that took Tara and I about 8 years to write, so it's in good bookshops. Anyway, moving on. What will we lose in terms of professional excellence if we lose all that in the next generation? And if the career itself is seen as a very small part of your overall priorities, then will that lead to an atrophy of the profession and a change in who we attract for the next generation? Now, you might think that this would just not happen in surgery and that it will always be popular. But it is happening in other professions if we think about nursing and teaching. And one of my senior colleagues retired a couple of years ago, and he told me how he had one secretary throughout his whole career who only looked after him, and she did everything for him, including buying his gift for the staff secret Santa. And nowadays, that sort of person would be very rare. At least if you were lucky enough to have someone like that, they would probably also look after 4 or 5 other consultants. And that is because the kind of person of a generation ago probably has ambitions to move into other roles quite quickly. So the job will always be filled, but when we think about what makes a good surgeon brilliant, it involves a number of qualities that aren't necessarily easily teachable. And so that's why we've got to be thinking about how we continue to attract the best school leaver if we're going to maintain standards. Many of you will be familiar with these generational stereotypes. They are, after all, just stereotypes, and they're designed to illustrate how different generations have slightly different, or may have slightly different values, and interestingly, at the moment, different categories of different grades of trainee fall quite neatly into those categories. But we're entering an interesting juncture where I, as a millennial, now sit at the same consultant table as my so-called Generation X and Boomer colleagues. And we're now one team needing to unite behind one vision of how we want to run our department in terms of training and pastoral care. And when any of us thinks about how we'd want to run our department, it's natural to go back to the mantra that was handed down to us. And for me, that's this so-called boomer generation approach to medicine, where you really focus everything. But given everything we've learned about how much has changed, I constantly find myself asking myself, can I still ask this of our trainees? Are we offering them the same end result as I will be given? And this is important because over the next 10 to 15 years, we are going to have to find the next Jeremy, Shaq, Azar, Sharif. And I know that my colleagues got to the levels they got to by a huge amount of dedication and focus without distractions. It can be hard for us to understand why different generations should have different expectations and fulfillments from their medical career. And so a surgeon that has received a lot of societal prestige, autonomy, camaraderie, might be imminently more willing to sacrifice their weekends or care less about finances. But if you take away a load of things in a generation, then it's not surprising that the factors that remain are brought into sharper focus and are more of a deal breaker. And therefore, it would be wise for us not to advise our own children about this career based on our own lived experience. Now, many of you will have watched this on iPlayer. It is, after all, caricatured and fictional, and it was set in 2006. But there were some interesting dynamics that you will have noticed. The SHO, who was highly diligent and ambitious, but ultimately worked in a system that set her up to fail, she carried on in the hope that she would become the registrar, who himself was rather ground down by the system and drained of all empathy, but carried on in the hope that he would become the consultant, who was evidently very wealthy, but also consciously distanced from all the difficulties of the system on the ground. But what we might find is that in the next generation, actually that SHO doesn't become the registrar, and that registrar doesn't really practically change into the life of a consultant. Many of you will have read this Royal College of Surgeons report on equality and diversity within surgery, and it's clear that many surgeons of a previous generation had to put up with a lot of difficult behaviours that no doubt today would have been called out as grossly unacceptable, presumably because at the time they didn't feel protection from whistleblowing, or that they felt that ultimately it would be okay and they would be protected and it would all be worth it. But if the end result changes, it's not unreasonable that today's juniors might look elsewhere rather than make do with that. And so I think this is probably one of the most crucial dynamics in the future of our profession, in all directions, intergenerational empathy. So if I am a young trainee and I am frustrated by my senior colleagues' unflinching expectations of me, I need to try and first understand the journey that they went through, the sacrifices they made in their junior years, the frequent moves, the job insecurity, the childcare sacrifices. And that generation definitely deserves my reverence and respect for all that they did, and the expectation that in their senior years it should be reciprocated to them. On the flip side, if I'm a senior consultant who can't understand why my trainee, whose career depends on me, isn't jumping to write my book chapter or work an extra weekend or arrange childcare to cover my operating list, I probably need to understand their personal economic and social circumstances rather than apply my own values. So we started this talk by questioning whether it was a lack of resilience and working long hours that led to burnout. Well, I would suggest that actually burnout is caused much more by the stress of expectation disappointment. And that can happen at all tiers of the medical field. And this equation probably sums up what I'm trying to get at. That if we can't change the reality, the inflation, the wages, the whatever else, then maybe the answer is for us to change the expectation we place on each other. And so what I'm getting at is that I think surgeons as a whole profession need each other more than ever before. And it wouldn't be fair of me to end having listed a load of problems. So, and I don't necessarily have the solutions, but I will finish by making 12 suggestions for how I think we can mitigate this. And I do think that specialties and departments that adopt some of these will flourish as a result. So firstly, if you're in a position of responsibility, try your best to resist professional fees rising faster than doctors' salaries. If you're running a course, remember that trainees need courses more than ever now. And so if you're running a course that costs £1,500 that's not centrally funded, bear in mind that that might price some trainees out of that training, and it might only contribute to an imbalance in equality and diversity. Evolve your service to one that expects parental leave rather than reacts to it. So I still think when I see the few trainees in our rotation that take parental leave, they're often not replaced, and that means that they're naturally anxious about going on leave, which I feel really sad about. And there's no easy answer to that, but wouldn't it be amazing if in the offers and discounts section of the RSM there was something on emergency childcare provision, or that there was a creche in the RSM? These are all wild ideas, but something to think about. Create a culture that empowers young parents without help to take parental leave, go part-time, do the school run. So every given year, I might have a trainee that has to do the school run, which means they might miss the first 15 minutes of our weekly MDT. Now, I know that's not ideal, but I also know that if we can help that trainee to float and stay afloat during those years, that they're more likely to carry on and not quit, and therefore benefit the profession in the longer term. And so seeing the bigger picture is probably what I need to do in that situation. If you're a consultant with parent trainees under pressure, normalise it. So make it a conversation topic at work, make it visible. It's going to be more visible than it ever was a generation ago. And of course, we all know that if a trainee struggles during a year with you, that it can take a long time to shift a negative reputation. So let's also bear that in mind. Consider what extracurricular work really makes a good surgeon. So when I look at the selection criteria, there are still mention of having done the 4th second cycle audit. Does it really make me a better surgeon, or are there better ways of testing resilience? Of course, we do have to select on merit, but there might be better ways of doing it that mean that surgeons can be surgeons and also have a healthy life outside medicine. A waiting room like that stresses anyone, and I think that in the next generation, let's remember that we will be held to higher standards of scrutiny. That means if you are rushing your clinic, you are making yourself more vulnerable, and the only people that are going to defend those safe levels are us. And so it's something that we need to think about. Today's hierarchy is flatter, and we can use that to our advantage. When I look at the medical students that come and sit in my clinic, they are coming from different backgrounds to me. They've had a different schooling, they look different, they wear different clothes, and that is a good thing if I can make sure that I use those opportunities to get to know different types of people, different to me, because they will soon be my SHOs, and I need to be in a position where I can understand them and give them the appropriate pastoral care. And that means that they need to be in a position where they can be candid with me about their personal situation and circumstances without fearing career judgment. We would never go into an operation without the required instruments, but yet increasingly we are willing to go into work without the necessary administrative support. And I think this is something I feel very strongly about, that we, again, need to be guarding against the under-hiring of administrative support so that surgeons can be surgeons, and we're not increasingly asking our registrars to do more and more electronic ordering of this and that. Now, the last 9 points, you might say to me, well, you've just listed a load of things that take pressure off trainees, and how does it all add up? And I think that there's not necessarily an easy solution, but I think one way is that we can make training more efficient by making succession planning a lot more intentional than it is now. So if I can say to a trainee that in 2 years' time you're going to take my place, then that gives 2 valuable years to set their focus on what's required and set them up with an outgoing mentor that can pass on all that valuable knowledge and experience in a much more focused way. And that might involve appointing people to consultant posts before they go on fellowship. But I do think, and some of my colleagues have spoken about this publicly, that that probably is the way to mitigate training in the direction that it's going. The mentality of in my day may not necessarily be what's needed for my children's generation. And lastly, to say that when you're in a leadership position, always be representing and negotiating the needs of the person taking your job in 10 years' time, rather than what we need now. And I leave you with that letter that I posted at the beginning. So as the world changes, we as surgeons need to be constantly evolving our value system in order to continue to attract the best young surgeons, school leavers. And I think that intergenerational empathy is going to be crucial to maintaining a great team. Thanks very much.
Wow. We all need to take a deep breath in. Thanks, Joe. So I think you can all see why I was desperate for Joe to be able to deliver that talk in person, because I think that is, certainly for my year in office, the most important talk that has been on my session. So thank you, Joe.